Good afternoon, good morning to everybody. My name is Konrad Pędziwiat. Warm welcome on behalf of the Multiculturalism and Migration Observatory. Today's seminar will be on refugee entrepreneurship, challenges and opportunities. I will very briefly just mention a few sort of technical cases, issues, and then I will pass it to the moderator, that is Jan Brzozowski. So this seminar, as all our seminars, will be recorded, and then we'll make it available through our YouTube channel. So all persons except speakers will be muted by me and Dobrusha, and the possibility will be to ask questions in the chat during the presentations, and then after the presentations we'll have Q&A session. All persons who do not want to share their videos, please switch it off and just ask the questions through the chat, due to the fact that we will make this video available after the seminar. So without any delays, I'm passing now the mic to Jan Brzozowski, who will lead today's seminar.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be here with great speakers. The topic of refugee entrepreneurship is definitely a very hot topic in studies on entrepreneurship and in migration studies, especially that it is a rather new research agenda. And today we have actually two pioneers of this research strand, Sibyl and Jörg, and one younger representative of the strand. Actually, this is for me also extremely interesting, because we tend to somehow associate refugee entrepreneurship obviously with immigrant entrepreneurship and with some concepts and theories developed within this strand of literature. However, obviously, as Jörg and Sibyl have already demonstrated in their studies, there is a lot of very peculiar features among refugees which make them a very special object of our research. This includes much higher propensity to become entrepreneur than even in the case of migrants, who are already well known as those who are more likely to become entrepreneurs compared to natives or representatives of the host society. And the same is about the problem of human capital transferability in the case of refugees. This is even more troubled than in the case of other migrants. So there are a lot of push and pull factors towards entrepreneurship when it comes to refugees, and we obviously, for a set of reasons, know still very little about them, both about the dynamics of refugee entrepreneurship, about its origins and the perspectives of development. And especially now with the COVID pandemic, there is another disturbing, let's say, factor, intervening factor, which makes this topic so interesting. So today we have three wonderful speakers, and I will introduce each one before the presentation. So for the first speaker is Sibyl Heilbrum. She is currently the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at Kinneret College of the Sea of Galilee. Sibyl is a sociologist who studies migration and in particular immigrant entrepreneurship. She also holds a research fellowship at the Institute of the Research of the Kibbutz and the Cooperative Idea at the University of Haifa, and she has published a lot of papers, books on this topic. Sibyl, the floor is yours.
I do have a PP, So if you can let me have the screen.
Yes, you can have the screen.
Okay, share, thanks. Here we go. Well, I want to start and say some things about Israel and refugees in Israel, and then I will talk about a model which we, together with a colleague and friend, we were thinking about dealing with Rosalisa Iannone from Luxembourg, about a model about the refugee entrepreneurship. And then I will again see to what extent the different propositions fit the Israeli case. Now, I want to say that in a way, Israel is, wait a second, why doesn't this move? Oh, here we go. Israel is a special case for a number of reasons. And the first reason is that the definition of the state of Israel is overlapping with religion/nationality. So actually in Israel, either you are Israeli born, as the Arab Palestinian population was born, people who are born in Israel, and then you can become Israeli, or you must be Jewish. So if you want to migrate to Israel, and Israel has a very developed and, let's say, accepting migration policy, if you are Jew, no matter where you are, the moment you set your foot on Israeli ground, you are an Israeli and you receive all the rights that Israelis have. This, of course, has to do with the history of the Holocaust, saying then that there needs to be a place where Jews can always feel safe, which makes sense, of course. But then if we look at this today, that means that Israel is actually not taking part in the global, I would say, effort to deal with refugees. So if you think about like all these discussions going on in terms of Europe and the US and Canada and who's going to accept how many refugees, Israel is not part of this entire discourse because per definition, there are no refugees in Israel. So another thing which is, I'm even a little bit ashamed to say it, but that's the truth. In Israel, refugees are called infiltrators. And they are called like this, like consistently by politicians, except by the politicians from the left side of the political arena. And they are consistently called like this in newspapers, in the media. So they are actually being tagged as a population which comes to infiltrate Israel and do harm, because that's the definition of infiltration. And then this very, very absurd situation occurred that about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, there was an inflow of refugees from Africa, usually mostly from Eritrea and South Sudan. And there were about 50, 60,000 of these people who came in a very short time when things got really, really bad in Eritrea and South Sudan. And then Israel actually reacted with a wall. And since Israel is a kind of island, so you have lots of control over who's coming in and who's not coming in, because there are very little opportunities to come in. And the moment they actually closed the possibility to come in from Egypt, no more refugees came in at all to Israel. So what's happening now, as you can see, from the 60,000, about 28,000 are left. And they are those who managed not to be deported, because Israel did deport, and they did deport usually in some kind of, weird bilateral agreement with the states, Eritrea and South Sudan, And there are stories that it's very, very challenging for these people to go back there. But the main thing is that other than in most of, or nearly all of the countries I know, in Israel, the refugees are actually in a complete legal void or limbo. They are actually illegal, but have some kind of legal status, which doesn't give them the right to work, and it doesn't give them the right to have any kind of social security. And it's like as if they are invisible. So having said this, there's all kind of policies trying to put them into detention camps. I did write an article about the institutional, about how refugees are bricolaring in an institutional void, which is actually intended. So there was entrepreneurial behavior going on outside it in so-called open detention camp, which, by the way, by now is closed because the High Court decided that this against human law, so they actually closed it after they had it open for a number of years. So the situation of the refugees in Israel is very difficult and is also kind of special, and it's deteriorating. And in the end, I will say something about the second paragraph. Of course, because of this legal limbo, they are or void, the pandemic is having a very, very bad impact on their situation, and I will get back to that. So here is our book with Jörg and Aki from Bremen, and you probably all know about it, which is more a case study book, which we think was very important because it's like the first books telling the stories, giving voices to these refugee entrepreneurs. And along the line, we were always looking for models dealing with the particularity of refugees in comparison with migrants. And I would like to talk you through this model, and then in the end, close it up with the Israeli case. So if you have a look at like the first idea, which would be when we look at refugee entrepreneurship, we have to take into consideration the way they came from their country of origin to the country of residence, because there are big differences between refugees from various regions, and there are big differences on how the journey impacts what they're actually able to do in the country of residence in terms of employment or self-employment or entrepreneurship. It doesn't matter. And we think that this is an important thing to look at. And obviously, like the Syrian refugees coming into Europe during the last couple of years are not the same as the African refugees, who still try to get into Europe via the sea, and some of them came to Israel, by the way, via Sinai and Egypt. So we think that the journey in itself has to be taken into consideration when looking at entrepreneurship of and refugees in the receiving country, because the journey also determines who is coming as a refugee, whether it's a family, whether there's a young people, whether that are husbands alone leaving their family behind. I just give you a very small example. This morning, somebody from the student dean's office was here because it turns out there's a refugee from Eritrea who has been here for over 10 years. He attended high school, and now he's trying to become a student at our college, an engineering school. Now we have a big problem. He doesn't have an identity card. So we even have problems to give him scholarships. So we are going to deal with it, and he's going to study, but it's, again, his legal situation is so complicated that even if we say we want him, and we do want him, a lot of scholarships are not open to him because he doesn't have an identity number. So that makes definitely a difference. I think many of you heard me talking about the model of George, who I don't remember her first name, although we talked over the phone, who said that we have to try to have a typology of types of refugees, because again, the refugees, they are not the same. And what she said is that we should have a look at the motivation to leave the host country, the home country. We should have a look at what kind of population group they belong to in their home country, which made them leave. And we should look also at the different or at the cultural similarities or differences of between the refugees and the country they're arriving in. So this makes lots of sense, because of course, again, there are big differences between refugees, and the same refugees coming from Africa to Israel and from Israel to, or from Africa to Germany would receive different kind of typology concerning this model, if not very different, but still different. So that's something I think we should take into consideration. The third thing, which is very important in Israel, but not only, and is now getting more attention, is that there are different asylum or refugee policies in different countries. And there are big differences as to how refugees receive which kind of status, which gives them or doesn't give them the possibility to enter the labor market, for example. And then when they enter the labor market, to decide whether they want to be self-employed or employed. So we always give this is the Swedish asylum process, but I could give now another 10 of these slides, and you would see quite differences between the countries as how they handle this entire process, and how the countries handle the process has lots of impact on refugee entrepreneurship. And again, I can say that between the US and European countries, there are differences, but also within the European countries, there are huge differences, like between Poland, Hungary, and Germany. I think you would find that the process is different and probably giving different opportunities to refugees to become either involved in the labor market or what I would call self-employed or entrepreneurs. At the demand side, of course, we have to deal with things which then I think this slide is not very different between refugee entrepreneurs and migrant entrepreneurs, because like the educational issue, the issue of problems to acquire land or to buy land or houses, the lack of job opportunity because you're an immigrant, because you are other, because you're looking different. These are all things which have a huge impact, not only on refugee entrepreneurship, but also on migrant entrepreneurship. And also, you know, discrimination faced due to negative attitude of health professionals is like one good example, where in Israel, the Jewish migrants from Ethiopia faced huge discrimination because they were considered to come from Africa, and they were considered in health, I wouldn't say danger, but like a challenge. And there was this big demonstrations going on when the health ministry didn't want to accept blood donations from Ethiopian Jews because they were said to have a higher possibility of HIV. So these things, I think, are not so different between migrants and refugees, again, depending on the country, of course. So as I said in the beginning, I think the institutional framework is a very important thing we have to look at. I just want to say some things about the supply side factors. There are so many stressors of people for people or in people who are refugees, which I think we can hardly imagine. You know, when I did do the field work, I saw these people struggling day by day, again and again, for the basic things we're taking for granted. And also this illegality, this being afraid to be caught on the street, not knowing what's going to happen, knowing that they're not going to be deported because Israel signed the Helsinki Act, and as long as it is not acceptable to deport to certain areas, this Israel has not done, but still it's like a constant insecurity, risk-taking, which very much influences the way these people can, you know, set up businesses, invest, think about new ideas. I think it's always amazing that this happens at all. So then comes the big question, of course, whether if there is possibility to be integrated into the labor market, what is the right path? And in the book, no, not in the book, no, but we interviewed a couple of people in Israel. I think we interviewed 17 refugee entrepreneurs. And I remember that there was one saying, I did make more money when I was working as an employee, but I want to be my own boss. So he actually quit work and set up a business for, if I remember right, that was like a photograph. He was a photographer, and his business, he made less money than he made as an employee. But then we also interviewed others who said that they would really like to be employed, so they would have a kind of stable income month after month and not have to worry how to feed their families a week after. So this is also very much a matter of, I think, personality. That's a matter of legal issues, because of course everybody, all the refugees in Israel who are employed are in a kind of uncertain status also via their employers. But I think what we have to take into consideration, and I wrote about this concerning migrants, that not necessarily is the self-employment option the option which will lead to integration of refugees or migrants into the society. Sometimes employment is a better integration option because of the structures, because you're usually not alone. You're working within a company. You're meeting people who are not all of them migrants and not all of them refugees. So the exposure to the home, to the receiving country is often greater when you are employed than when you are self-employed. So I think that's something we should just have in the back of our mind, because we're also always very enthusiastic about how entrepreneurship can deal or lead to integration. And I think we have to have second thoughts about this sometimes. So the emerging entrepreneurial types, which came up, and they are also in the literature. And I think also we have to see whether we can, how they should be like integrated into like a comparison with migrant entrepreneurship, is all these names called disadvantaged entrepreneurship, which more or less Miller and Miller-Breton used, bricolage entrepreneurship, very much used by Ted Baker and these people talking bricolage, inclusive entrepreneurship, more the people in the social work area, underdog, it's again Miller and Miller-Breton, emergency entrepreneurship, which I know less about, but sometimes this is used when talking about, I know that Leo Dana talks about it when saying that dealing with the earthquake in the earthquake in New Zealand, there were all kind of entrepreneurial initiatives coming up in a state of emergency. Probably also we could have a look at it, interestingly enough, now in COVID-19, and survivalist entrepreneurship we all know. So I think what we wanted to point to is here that refugee entrepreneurs, they can be all kinds of entrepreneurs. They are not, I wouldn't put them next to disadvantaged bricklayer and so on, but they can choose to a certain extent what kind of entrepreneurs they would like to be. So a tentative model of refugee entrepreneurship should deal with these proposals I was talking about, and I will just do it fast and then enter and just give an example for Israel. Account for refugees' history. So as I said, the refugees in Israel came from African countries. They had a very challenging journey. Lots of people died, lots of people were exploited. They came into Israel usually alone. The typology depends where you look at, but I would say with the Israeli case, the refugees are those who came from countries very different from Israel. They came usually because of they were politically or personally in danger, like the people coming from Eritrea. They were those running away from the army, which kind of tried to catch them for the rest of their lives. And not only in Israel, but also in other countries, these people, they said, either we stay in Eritrea and we will be soldiers for the rest of our lives, or we are going to run away. And also political persecution, of course, not belonging to the right tribe. So, and then usually the ones I talked to in Israel were people who actually planned to run away, to be refugees. Very few of them said, I just started walking and decided that's it, I'm now going to leave this country. One of them had the story saying he got up one morning and he decided it's either now or never, and he just started to take his stuff and went away and never planned it. But others said they were planning. And of course, if you are able to plan, there's a difference, because you can, you know, get organized with papers, you can get organized probably with money and so on. So this is a very important thing to take care of. Institutional framework, more and more, I think, is a main issue, a major issue. The legal status, the legal status in the long run, what's the horizon, what's the possibility of refugees to get citizenship? Is there such a possibility? These are very important things which have to do with policy and institutional framework. The contextualized dimension, it's like at the demand side, who are they? What is asked for them? At the supply side, who are they? What is the human capital they can throw into the situation, trying to be either employed or self-employed? And what, of course, are the contextual dimensions important in this in these conditions? And I would say in Israel, all of these are living in a south of Tel Aviv, which has become a kind of, I would say, city in itself, community in itself, with schools and kindergartens and so on. Many of the refugees I interviewed have very high human capital, because, as always, and this is so sad to say, those who managed to flee were the ones with more resources, not only personal and human resources, but also capital resources, because often they had to pay lots of money. So I think we have, and I think it's the same for Syrian refugees in Europe. Some of them are with high human capital potential, because these are the ones who managed to come to Europe. The other ones stayed in Jordan and Turkey. So these are things which definitely have to be taken into consideration. Again, labor integration, we talked about it. I think this has to be looked upon in every situation in itself. In Israel, it depends very much on the people we interviewed. Most of them decided to become entrepreneurs. Some of those decided they became entrepreneurs because they didn't find work and others because they wanted to be more independent. We have this one case, which is also in our book, of this person who set up a kindergarten, which is still working, which has also a social entrepreneurial motivation. And again, I think when we look at the interplay of demand and supply side, then we can probably extract the different types of entrepreneurship of refugees I was talking before. This again has to be looked at specifically. I think in Israel, I would say most of them are disadvantaged entrepreneurs, and most of them like a combination of disadvantaged and survivalists. So I'm okay with, I hope I'm okay with the time. I would like to say just very shortly that COVID has been very, very challenging for the refugee community in South Tel Aviv. Many of the small businesses closed. Many of the entrepreneurs had no way to survive. Actually, there are civil NGOs have been stepping in and more or less keeping these people somehow alive. There is a humanitarian crisis, but again, that's a completely different lecture. There are NGOs providing more or less everything for these refugees in South Tel Aviv, which is like completely different outline and outlook than the government, but it happens. But there's no question that the COVID has definitely closed down nearly all of the entrepreneurial businesses I knew, and only those which are connected with food, and now lately a little bit everything coming back, like with kids. These are now popping up again and are going back into business. Everything which had to do with photographs, with ceremonies, with the marriage, and all these kind of things which couldn't take place during the last year, just evaporated, and the situation is very challenging. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot for this extremely interesting attempt to more or less classify the phenomenon of refugee entrepreneurship. Although based on Israel, I think there are some also general findings stemming from this model. I would suggest, if you have just very technical questions to the paper, you can ask now, but if there are some more general issues, especially connected to Israel situation, let's collect the questions for the Q&A section in the chat window. So I don't know if I see some ad hoc, very quick questions.
No.
No, I think the suggestion is to keep it.
Yeah. No, because sometimes, you know, people have just very quick technical questions connected to some issues of presentation which they misunderstood. So I think we can give the voice to our second speaker. Just a quick introduction. Jörg Freiling is a full professor at the University of Bremen. In the Lemex chair in small business and entrepreneurship. He has an extensive experience in entrepreneurial studies, and in particular on migrant entrepreneurship. He had organized several rounds of conferences on migration and diaspora entrepreneurship, in which also I had the pleasure to participate. And of course, he had conducted several research projects on refugee entrepreneurship. Jörg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jan, for this kind introduction. and also for the invitation. I'm quite happy to be here in this webinar, and I think it's a very good idea and very, very kind from you to host such a webinar and to contribute to international research activities that slow down to a very large extent and sometimes always completely. And so far, I'm really happy to be here on stage jointly with Sibylle and with Nina. We all know each other from several meetings before, so it's a privilege to be here and to talk a little bit about research on entrepreneurship. I just asked myself, what can I tell to you regarding what Sibylle already mentioned? And I think there are three things I could address. The first thing is I can report a little bit on a book chapter I wrote with Aki Harima and contributed to the book Sibylle already mentioned on refugee entrepreneurship. This chapter is about researching refugee entrepreneurship cases to identify certain patterns, which is not so easy, by the way. The second thing is I can tell you a little bit about a publication project on resilience in case of refugee entrepreneurship. This is also a project I conduct together with Aki Harima and Tenzin Yeshi, and I saw both of them here in this meeting. And finally, I can close with a little bit a work in process thoughts on the COVID-19 impact on refugee entrepreneurship. I also prepared a PowerPoint presentation and I tried to open it. I hope you can see it well. If not, please let me know. First, some key research findings I already talked about. This is about these two-digit number of cases we collected for the refugee entrepreneurship book. And our intention was to identify a certain kind of common denominator in refugee entrepreneurship cases. And as you have already heard a little bit by the presentation of Sibylle, this is not so easy to be done because of certain idiosyncrasies depending on the context. And insofar, this is really one basic result we could take away from this project, that context, particularly external and to some extent internal context, matters really much. So there is much variety and little common ground, but there is some common ground, and maybe I can sketch it out briefly. If we want to understand what makes a difference, I think that Sibylle gave us already a very, very good introduction and socialization into the topic. And we can roughly structurize the thoughts according to the following three bullet points, like the home country matters, the flight route matters, and even the host country matters. And in this way, I will, only in a very few minutes, sketch out what the findings have been. First, if we take a look at the home country, the question why the refugees fled, you see that, the reasons behind are quite different in nature. Sometimes war or civil war is to some extent the answer. Sometimes it's a little bit more specific, that a certain kind of personal prosecution took place, or that, for instance, a prosecution was directed to a certain social group or a different kind of group. You see here, maybe the situation is to some extent comparable to the first one. But there are other reasons we could identify why people became refugees. Social exclusion is, for instance, one thing, or simply even poverty or disease. And if we take a look at some African countries in the Sahel zone, you will see that sometimes they have no alternative due to climate change issues than to leave the place where they lived in order to find a new basis for their living. Yeah, insofar you see the flight reasons are very important starting points of the journey, and they are quite different, and they go along with different kinds of mental and sometimes even physical imprints. And this is something that hurts to a large extent and casts a shadow even on their future. Yeah, and the imprint is to some extent very specific, and we also saw by the cases that homesickness sometimes hurts severely, while in other cases it did not play really an important role and could be neglected. This was also one of the findings we could take away from that. Flight route matters is the second thing, and we had way many differences regarding the length of the flight in terms of, for instance, the duration. Sometimes, it was a little bit an odyssey of the people. They left the home country, and it took sometimes years in order to find the country where they finally chose or were allowed to stay. And this is, of course, a complete different situation from a journey that is that does not last very much longer than a couple of days or weeks. The question Sibylle briefly touched on is, did they stay in reception camps? And Sibylle, you mentioned even the term detention camps or not, is important because also this stay in a camp casts a certain shadow on the people and on their minds. And insofar, it's important to take a look at that as well. And even the question, did the refugees have a clear target country, or was it really an odyssey they were on? And insofar, you can see also here there is very much variety and long journeys. You can imagine take away lots of energy of the people, but at the same time they could also make them a bit stronger because they learn to cope with new states, adversities, and maybe that could be in some cases useful to build resilience and hope. And the final thing is the host country matters. Is the host countries, and over here is the host country a new home country? This is what the question is about, or is it more a waiting room? That means you are there, you are happy for a moment to be in such a country where you can stay, but you're quite sure that you're going to leave this country at next occasion. The other thing is a host country open-minded and friendly, and is the state of open-mindedness, if it is available, is it really a steady state in times where globalization is a state that is questioned more and more in our societies? Yeah, and moreover, is there a huge cultural and language gap between people from the host country and the refugees? This is also very, very important for the question of mutual understanding. And finally, is there an infrastructure for refugee entrepreneurs, or a landscape of institutional voice, as I termed it over here? This is also something you can observe in certain host countries. Yeah, refugee entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs are often regarded as an asset and a liability at the same time in the same host country society. And well, in so far you see that well, you are confronted with different kinds of reactions, and also these reactions have a certain impact on your mind and your willingness, your career opportunities, and very often you see that refugee entrepreneurship is a chosen option due to a lack of alternatives. So what we can say is finally that refugee entrepreneurship business is often very different, very often necessity driven. This is something we could take away from the cases we observed. And this holds this necessity entrepreneurship, at least for the first generation of refugee entrepreneurship. Once the business is settled and the second generation comes in, this might turn a little bit, but it depends on the run of events. Very often these businesses from refugee entrepreneurs are very small businesses, micro and small business according to the standard classifications, and family background, at least in the second generation, plays an important role. The family itself is very, very important as a port of socialization. The most important resources are human capital, social capital, and the support capital in the host country. This is also something that we could observe by digging a little bit deeper into the cases. And we see that in case of refugees who have lost very many things, sense making stands at the fore. And yeah, finally, refugee entrepreneurship research could benefit. This was also one thing we carved out from positive psychology. And insofar we found even between the cases that, well, constructs like hope, the development of hope, the emergence of hope, resilience, and the feeling of security and things like that are very, very important in order to describe the run of events, and even to say something about a successful establishment of these kind of venturings. So this is what the core results of this research project were about. And directly tying in, we researched on the construct of resilience of refugee entrepreneurs with a focus on Germany. So while Sibylle casted the light on refugee entrepreneurship in Israel, the findings here are more related to Central Europe, to Germany in particular. And well, let us briefly dive into the topic. The objectives: first, to understand the emergence of resilience in case of refugee entrepreneurship, and even to understand the factors that influence the maintenance of resilience in this particular case. The research design, we conducted qualitative research, and it was an inductive procedure we followed. The data stems from 52 interviews of a duration between 40 and 80 minutes with 48 refugee entrepreneurs. Some of them we interviewed in sequence. So there were follow-up interviews with home countries, overly from Syria, Iran, and Afghanistan. Host country Germany, and the arrival of the refugees was between 2014 and 16. The data collection, by the way, took place between 2016 and 18. This is to some extent even the peak of refugees in Germany. And yeah, we selected refugees and asylum seekers in early phases of the business development. What are our findings? Well, we identified three mechanisms of resilience of refugee entrepreneurs. The mechanism of emergent resilience, the loss of resilience, and perpetuation. I will address that in a few seconds. And the mechanisms reveal that resilience is not an inherent advantage of refugees, but well, refugee entrepreneurs are in a strained relationship between losing this resilience over time and even a certain pressure to maintain it in order to stay strong and to establish the business. And we found that psychological, social, and institutional factors have a certain influence on resilience. So what characterizes our research project is that resilience is a dynamic process with multi-level influencing factors we are going to portray right now. In order to contrast a little bit prior research with our project, prior research pointed out that refugees often demonstrate quite strong resilience to cope with psychological issues like trauma, stress, and so on. And the studies also pointed out that they identified factors influencing how refugees promote resilience, for instance, pointing to the role of the family as an institution. Our findings relate to the more or less development, the evolution of resilience, so that the time factor is important. And we found that resilience is a quite fragile asset, and we found out that different subdimensions of the mechanisms help understanding in which direction resilience develops. So let us portray these mechanisms a little bit more in detail. Here's mechanism one, the emergence of resilience. And we saw that particularly hope is a very important factor in order to drive resilience. Very often we find quite motivated refugee entrepreneurs. They have a clear target, and in order to achieve a certain state of viability, so their motivation is existent. And at the same time, they fight for way power. That means, in our language, in our terms, opportunities in order to conduct business. And if way power and willpower come together, this typically constitutes hope. According to positive psychology, and even this hope is a very important cornerstone in order to explain how resilience of refugee entrepreneurs comes into being. And the question about how does resilience unfold? Well, host country and the venture of the refugee entrepreneurs are very often viewed as much safer ports compared to all previous stations they have been. So they are very often realizing that they almost lost everything. And insofar, they feel much better when starting a business in the host country where they are. And resilience is also driven by resourcefulness, and we can observe that bricolage related behavior and experimentation in order to check out anything that could be beneficial to the development of your business. This is also driving the emergence of resilience. Mechanism two is about the loss of resilience, and of course there is turbulence in the home countries and also in the minds of the refugee entrepreneurs, psychological turmoils, and there is a certain kind of afterglow of the flight. And once you settle down in the host country, you will see that there are some traumata on your mind, that you realize the loss when you move from your home country to another place on earth. And of course, you feel a little bit the disorientation in a new place where you live right now, associated with the risks in the host country. There are furthermore institutional barriers, just to mention the language barrier, which can be quite important and restrictive, the access to local infrastructure in the host country, particularly infrastructure supporting entrepreneurs. And very often, particularly in Germany, we see that there is a bureaucratic system of public government, and it's not really transparent for us, and even less so for refugees, of course, and refugee entrepreneurs. And finally, there are setbacks due to the uncertain legal status. You live on the edge to some extent, and you realize that you are a minority, and social exclusion is sometimes a fact here you are faced every day, and you feel a certain marginalization in the society where you live in. And this, of course, works into this direction. Finally, the mechanism of perpetuation of resilience. These are factors that reinforce the resilience. And here we talk about entrepreneurial support in the host country, for instance, incubators, virtual incubators, and accelerators like that. There is, of course, even the entrepreneurship capacity of refugee entrepreneurs themselves. Once they build it, once they capitalize on that, this has a push effect regarding resilience. Furthermore, there is network power due to mixed embeddedness, and well, the intercultural competencies are very important in order to understand how resilience perpetuates. And these intercultural competencies are very often mandatory and meaningful for developing the business of refugee entrepreneurs. Yeah. So far, I think the takeaways from this study are that refugee entrepreneurs find themselves in constant tension between maintaining and losing resilience. Unstable states of refugees' resilience influenced by individual, social, and institutional factors. And yeah, there are also certain mental conditions and socio-economic environments that have a certain impact on entrepreneurial resilience. Okay, so this is what we could take away from this study. Well, I promised you to talk about 3 different aspects, but regarding the time, I think it's better to stop now and to talk a little bit about the COVID topic in the discussion if there is a certain interest from the audience. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a lot, Jörg. Also, thanks for keeping the time rigidity. Sorry, this is my duty because we want to have time for more interaction also. So I think I will definitely inquire about COVID aspect when it comes to discussion. Our third speaker is Nina Bilal from Warsaw University. She's a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Management. She's also directing a Prologue grant from National Center of Sciences on refugee entrepreneurship in Sweden, and she has recently published a paper with Beata Glinka in Administrative Sciences on the very same issue. I will even put in the chat window the link to the paper, which is in open access. Nina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me share the screen first to see whether it works properly and I can change the slides. I hope so. You can see my presentation now? Okay, I guess so. Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me here. I need to acknowledge that for me, it's a great opportunity to, share some of my PhD research with you, and it's still work in progress. So I would be really happy to get feedback, comments, suggestions. All of this is really, really welcome. And to start, I will decided to show you this simple diagram, just to show you where I am with my research idea, and let's say the main theoretical framework as well. So this diagram is like a simplified version, extremely simplified version of, let's say, literature review and research gaps. And the most important point is this yellow dot in the middle, and it's the intersection of three strands of literature I want to contribute to with my research. So it's refugee entrepreneurship, immigrant entrepreneurship, and integration. I would say that this diagram contains two big conversations, academic conversations I want to refer to in my research. The first one is between the field of immigrant entrepreneurship and integration. And as you know, most of the research is dedicated to how immigrant entrepreneurship can enhance integration of newcomers. And this is why I actually want to focus on this reverse relationship. So how actual integration of newcomers can take a part in forming their entrepreneurial intentions. So this is one big thing. And second is, let's say, this big academic debate between refugee entrepreneurship and immigrant entrepreneurship. And as it has been mentioned here already, and you all know, refugee entrepreneurship is a relatively new field. It mostly started developing in 2015, when there was this big influx of asylum seekers. I would say then the moments got more intense. And it's definitely aspiring to become an independent field of research. And most of the studies in this field are qualitative. And this is also why I'm actually conducting quantitative research in this field. So this is first important information. And second, the colors I have used here are not random either. It's navy blue and yellow, and these are the colors of the Swedish national flag. So as you already know, I'm doing this study in the context of Sweden. And as it was mentioned already by my speakers, by previous speakers, this context matters a lot, and it's extremely important. So let me move on. And can you see the next slide? Oh, now, can you see the next slide? Yeah, okay, cool. So I will talk about the determinants of refugee entrepreneurial intentions in the context of Sweden. I will start with the research questions. Number one, under what conditions are immigrants more likely to start a business in the host country? Number two, how does the legal entry status impact the entrepreneurship of the immigrants? And here I wanted to share with you, it's like a very, very preliminary proposition of the theoretical model I want to come up with in my PhD dissertation. It's a huge challenge to, make something not too simplistic, but not too complex at the same time. So this is, let's say, some kind of compromise, which is still work in progress. I called it Pyramid of Immigrant and Refugee Entrepreneurial Intention. And as you can see, it's like really much inspired by the mixed embeddedness theoretical framework of Klusterman. I distinguish here the three dimensions, macro, meso, and micro, which take part in shaping the entrepreneurial intentions of immigrants. But of course, those levels, I have defined them in a different way. The micro level is mostly about personal characteristics and human capital. The meso level and macro level, these are two levels where I also want to discuss, translate them into integration framework. And also on the left side, I was trying to make it more clear for those of you who see it for the first time, and these are all of you actually. I wrote down all the index factors I have created on the basis of my data. So these are actually the constructs I'm interested in at those specific levels. And to test my theoretical model, first of all, I wanted to say I have formulated a series of 18 hypotheses, but I decided not to show them here and read it one by one because it wouldn't make much sense, most probably. It will be much clearer for you when I show you the graphs, the models, and each arrow will be a hypothesis. But I have formulated a series of hypotheses, and to test my theoretical model, I am using two Invandrer Index data sets. These are the data sets collected in 2017, and they were the data was collected while conducting online surveys in schools where foreigners can study Swedish. The data set, both data sets, they contain refugees, economic migrants, family reunion migrants who arrived to Sweden between 2011 and 2017. And these are people who are between 14 to 70 years old. Each data set consists more than 100 questions. Respondents had 60 minutes to answer them, and the questionnaire was translated into 6 languages. So in total, both data sets contain almost 4,000 respondents. And so just short visualizations, these are the two data sets. The first one is focusing on adults, people from 18 to 70 years old, and the second, it's more about youth. So people like teenagers and young adults. And now I will actually quickly go through some of the most important descriptive statistics to show you what's in those data sets. So who are we dealing with? And I will start with the first data set, which is mostly focused on adults. So in terms of gender, the ratio is almost equal of men and women. The average age is about 34 years old. So in majority, these are, I would say, young people with the average in the early 30s. In terms of migration status, the majority, so 60% are refugees, then 32.5% family reunion migrants, and 6.6% are economic migrants. And when did they come to Sweden? Like, no surprise, most of them, so more than 42%, came in 2015. Yeah, and the rest you can see in the graph. Where did they come from? So once again, no surprise, almost half of them came from Syria. Then nearly 20%, these are people who came from different countries outside Europe, North America and South America. Then the two following biggest countries of the flight are Eritrea, Somalia. You can also see like it's Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and so on. And in terms of years of education, the majority have completed at least 13 years of schooling. Then you can see 28% 10 to 12 years of schooling, and so on and so on. Only 2.5% have not completed any school education in their home country. And what's their field of education, those who are educated? So like the biggest percentage are people who have no special education, but among others, it's teaching mostly. And these are mostly women who have got education in teaching and later experience. It's also administration, economics, law. And in general, you can see that this field of education they got is pretty diversified. In terms of previous experience, I think this is even more important than education. The most common is actually experience in teaching, sales, purchasing, marketing, but also building and construction, land management, healthcare. And once again, like in teaching and healthcare, there is actually quite big majority of women. And what's the future preferred field of work? So what do respondents answer when they are asked where do they see themselves in Sweden, which sector? So more than 1/5 answered teaching. Then also more than 18% hotel, restaurant, cafes, also industry, healthcare, building and construction, and so on and so on. And the, let's say, two most important questions, at least for my research, did you have a company in the past? More than 1/5 of respondents said yes, they did. They do have previous self-employment experience. And do you want to start a company in Sweden? Almost 40% of people say yes to this question. And here I would also like to say, because this is a very crucial question for my thesis, it's this question, I would say, it's not only about, like, the way I see it, based on the whole questionnaire and the research and the context. It's not just about the will to start a company in Sweden, but it also shows something more, right? This entrepreneurial mindset, attitude of someone who wants to do something more, so potentially someone who is more active in searching a job, and so on and so on. And this comment is also important, taking into consideration, you know, the research. So what's then, like usually also in other EU countries at least, it's always like this, that the percentage of people who want to start a company versus people who actually do this later, there's a huge gap in between. This is why I made this comment. Okay, and what about the youth data set? What's in it? There is a much bigger share of men than women. These are people who are mostly 17 and 18 years old. Most of them came to Sweden as refugees, and once again in 2015. They mostly come from Afghanistan, then Syria, Eritrea, Somalia, Thailand, and others. In terms of pre-migration schooling, almost 40% have completed from 6 to 9 years of education, then 25% 2 to 5 years of schooling, and so on. This maybe circular diagram shows it better. The majority of respondents have completed between 6 to 9 years of schooling. And then what about schooling in Sweden? Of course, it's not too long because they are all recently arrived migrants, but almost 40% have already completed 2 years of gymnasium in Sweden, and 32% less than 1 year. And in which area you want to educate yourself? So most of the people said healthcare, but here we have also data, IT, and it's also extremely diversified. So do you want to start a company in Sweden? Almost 50% said yes. So what are the findings? As I have said, I have used quantitative study, and taking into consideration the nature of my data, I have used logistic regressions, multivariate regressions, and t-tests. And this is the model I came up with analyzing the first data set, so adult data set. Just to discuss it briefly, in short, entrepreneurial intention here on the right side, this is my dependent variable. According to research, I treat the willingness to take risk as one of the most crucial components of entrepreneurial intention. Here below willingness to take risks, there are also some personal characteristics and human capital. And then what affects the willingness to take risks? I have distinguished such components as mental health, adaptation to Swedish norms, social barriers, institutional involvement, and commitment to place. So To put it briefly, I would say, do you see my mouse on the screen? Yes, okay. So those three are more like personal characteristics and human capital. Willingness to take risks and mental health. I have actually checked them and put them openly in the model, because these are the two constructs which are usually most cited in the literature. These are the two crucial differences which distinguish refugees from, I would say, non-refugees, from other types of migrants. And my study confirms those differences, which so far have been theoretically mostly discussed in the literature. And then these are the constructs which are mostly connected to the social integration. Of course, I have control variables, which are here, but none of them are statistically significant. And this is the second model related to this youth data set. So once again, on the right here, it's the dependent variable, entrepreneurial intention. Here is how I have worked out this model. The most important, once again, it's that the study confirmed that refugees differ from other types of migrants in terms of their mental health. So according to the literature, they are more likely to suffer from trauma because of their migratory experience. And my study confirms that. And here I have also the dimensions of social integration, which affect the perceived opportunities for young refugees. And then also my study showed that actually commitment to place is an important variable, which behaves differently in terms of adults, the first data set, and youth, the second data set. And here, once again, I have used the control variables, and only gender turned out to be statistically significant, and the difference is quite huge. So females, of course, are less likely to have entrepreneurial intentions. And I will now jump briefly to conclusions. What are the main findings I actually want to spread out with my research? So first of all, it's definitely the role of integration dimensions, which matters in shaping entrepreneurial intentions. Second, it's the, as I have said, it's the role of refugee migration status in determining entrepreneurial intention, and with particular focus on mental health and willingness to take risks. This is something which I'm testing quantitatively, which so far has been mostly discussed on the basis of the qualitative research. And the last but not least is that when it comes to other dimensions I am testing in my studies, it actually surprised me a lot, because besides mental health and willingness to take risks, in the study I'm doing, in the Swedish context, of course, and in the setup, integration versus entrepreneurial intentions, it looks like same dimensions of integration in the same magnitude play a role in shaping entrepreneurial intentions for both refugees and non-refugees. So I would finish with this question that it surprised me a little bit, but it seems that, at least in the Swedish context, this refugee status as a lens to look at the formation of entrepreneurial intention maybe it's not like the most important analytical framework. There are not so many differences between refugees and other and let's say non-refugees in terms of other dimensions. Here I've been thinking about some what it actually means. Definitely, since this mental health dimension has been confirmed, there's a need for available psychological support for refugees, enhanced integration policies, which could actually also boost the self-employment. Then it's let's say my proposition once again, at least on the basis of my research in this setup I have just discussed, on a policy level, maybe it's not that important to actually distinguish between refugees and other types of migrants. So I maybe have stirred a pot a little bit because it's a little bit contradictory to what you have presented in your presentations. But I definitely believe that this context matters a lot. And this is at least what my studies show in the case of Sweden. So thank you for your attention. And yeah, I'm looking forward to getting questions.
Okay, thanks a lot for this interesting presentation. And now I think we can start the Q&A session. So those who are willing to ask a question, please write the questions in the chat window.
Or just say who wants to ask the question in terms of, or raise your hands or in any other way. While waiting for the questions to emerge in the chat and elsewhere, I'd like to take the opportunity to have the first shot. First, I would like to ask the question to Sibyl on the case of Israel. I would be interested if you could share to say a little bit about the conditions how refugees get into Israel, especially in the last years. It seems to me that Israeli border is one of these super protected borders, and I was just wondering how this has been, how the migration flow actually looks like, especially in the last years. If you could say something about this.
That's a very simple answer, Konrad.
Mm-hmm.
They don't.
Mm-hmm.
There are no more refugees coming in for the last 7-8 years, because after this first big wave, they actually had the border closed.
Mm-hmm.
So there are no more refugees coming in, and those who are in Israel are those who have been coming in about 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also so they're not coming in.
Mm-hmm. And I was reading somewhere that there was a plan that the refugees that are in Israel were supposed to be sent to some of the Western countries, but this plan, as far as I understand, was not enforced. And what were the reasons for not enforcing this plan?
As far as I know, there were some kind of agreements from some of the refugees who were here went in the end to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know about the other countries, but Israel's main policy is make them go away.
Mm-hmm.
So anything which works making them go away is fine. So I don't know about, I know about bilateral connections with Canada, not bilateral, no, Canada accepting some of the refugees who are here, and also I think very few to Australia. But basically, those who are here are probably here to stay.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I think those who are here still, in spite of everything, there are those who have kids
Mm-hmm.
who were born in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And then the whole issue becomes more complicated also to get them deported, because once their kids are Israeli born, that's a completely different story.
Mm-hmm. And is there any thinking out of the Aliyah sort of box in terms of like the Aliyahs, the big Aliyahs, the return migrations have more or less finished, it seems like. Is there a continuous income of immigrants of Jewish origin immigrants to Israel, and is there any thinking about having immigrants from somewhere and allowing people to come in and work in Israel? How it works?
Well, Jewish immigrants are coming in all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Not very many, but it depends. That depends very much on other things. Like there were some coming in from, in the last years, the main group is coming in from France.
All right, okay. All right, thank you very much, because I wasn't sure about this background issues. As far as it was very interesting, your presentation as well, and I wanted to ask more, like a more general question about the whether there are any studies about the entrepreneurial activities of the Syrian refugees. Germany was one of the countries that has received the largest number of Syrian refugees within the last year, since 2015. And I was wondering, I've seen here and there some studies on this issue of generally labor market inclusion and entrepreneurship, but I would be interested if you could say something from your own work or from other works that you're probably much more well aware of than I am. What is the labor market situation of the Syrian refugees after 5-6 years since their arrival?
Well, interesting thing, and of course we studied a good number of cases, but maybe not enough in order to generalize. However, taking a look at other studies and the entire situation in Germany, I think it's possible to give you a certain reply on that. There are also a very big number of Syrian refugees going for entrepreneurship, and very often they just need to change a little bit the way what they do in terms of their business, and very often they open restaurants and do some other things. However, also labor market integration becomes an issue more and more. And we see that after some time, there is also a big effort of these Syrian refugees to understand even the host country society, and even to accept a little bit even formal requirements with regard to work qualification, and even to be quite strong and resilient to develop even their personal skills in order to be ready to get onboarded in companies. And so they did, particularly in earlier years. That means between 2017 and 19, it worked a little bit better. However, you can imagine that then, to some extent, the Corona shock was very, very severe, and came to the conclusion that actually there are no real employments, and very many companies are struggling, and insofar even those labor markets are in a very bad situation, where even these Syrian refugees need to redefine even their place in the society and the labor market. However, till 2019, they showed with considerable efforts and success that integration is possible, and not only within an ethnic enclave, but even in the entire society, which is also a remarkable thing.
Thank you very much. I think, Nina, you've got a question from York in the chat, so you can start with this one.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure, by recursive effects, you mean that there's not, let's say, flow of variables in only one direction, and loop effects. This is what you mean?
Exactly, it's possible. It came at least to my mind that also even the commitment to a place and entrepreneurial intention may have an impact on trust to Swedish integration, network access, and so on. It is interesting, maybe in the process of data analysis, whether these recursive effects are observable or even not. But very often we see in reality that there are not only one directional influences between variables. And this is at the heart of my question, right?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I mean, you know, honestly speaking, it's quite tricky to answer to you because I have learned a lot while conducting, those analyses. And I would say I'm still new to the field of quantitative research, but learning and getting there. And of course, to some extent, those variables are correlated, but there is no effect of multicollinearity, first of all. And when there are recursive effects, it comes, let's say, only to those variables which are, let's say, at the same level of analysis. So I would say this is something I have checked during the process, during the analysis. And of course, like anything in the social science, it's kind of related, right? And this also happens in my case, but it's not I would say, those recursive effects are not strong when it comes to different levels of analysis. I'm not sure if it's clear. But so let's say, for example, if there is social integration, those are, let's say, slightly correlated, but there's no multicollinearity effect. And then it's related to something else. But then in between those bigger levels, there are no recursive effects.
Thank you.
I think we had also missed a comment and also a question from Tenzin. Could you say a few words to, I think, to Sabile?
Yeah, hello. Thank you for all of your presentation. It was so great. And yeah, I think Sibila already wrote to me, so I've already got the answer. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So, I'm puzzled now because we are running out of time and I have 3 very long questions to all the speakers. So maybe in my case, to cure my curiosity, if you could allow, I could maybe email you with these questions if it's possible, because I don't want to take too much of the audience time and of your time, if it's possible, because I have my notes with me, so it's just a matter of typing them into the email account. Do we see any other comments or questions from the audience?
Not in the chat.
Not in the chat. So I think, yeah, so, well, the problem is that I have so many puzzling questions, but I have to wait for our bilateral exchange of emails to get the answer, and I look forward to discuss it with you. I think we have to close our meeting. Thanks a lot for fantastic papers. Our webinar, as you know, is recorded, so in a few hours we will have the recording online. So if you want, feel free to share it with your colleagues and cooperators. And thanks a lot for devoting your time to present your wonderful research to us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, right. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Have a good afternoon.
Have a good afternoon.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.